They were supposed to obey the samurai. Instead, they overthrew a provincial lord, built their own political order, and held their ground against some of the most powerful warriors in Sengoku, Japan. Even Tokugawa Ieyasu once faced rebellion from his own retainers. Then came Oda Nobunaga. He would spend years trying to destroy them. But the most dangerous thing about the Ikkō-ikki was never the weapons they carried. It was the loyalty that bound them together. That loyalty did not emerge from nowhere. By the late 15th century, Japan's political order was already fracturing. The Ashikaga shogunate had weakened, provincial authorities competed with ambitious local warriors, and the Onin War had accelerated a cycle of conflict that made older hierarchies increasingly difficult to enforce. Inside this unstable world, another kind of network was spreading. Communities connected to Jodo Shinshu, true Pure Land Buddhism, were expanding across central Japan. Under Renyo, one of the most influential religious leaders of the period, Hongan-ji strengthened its relationship with followers across villages, towns, temples, and warrior households. These communities had not been created as military organizations, but they connected people who normally answered to different political masters. Farmers and village elites could belong to them. So could merchants, religious leaders, and warriors. Letters, teachers, temples, and local congregations allowed relationships to extend beyond the authority of any single lord. That helps explain what later became known as the Ikkō-ikki. The name can create the misleading image of one vast peasant army under a unified command. In reality, different uprisings emerged from different local conditions. Their participants could come from several levels of society, and their goals were not always identical. What they shared was the ability to mobilize through relationships that samurai authority did not completely control. Most of the time, political and religious loyalties could coexist. But when a ruler threatened the institutions of a community's faith, those loyalties could collide. The first spectacular demonstration came in Kaga. Kaga was already unstable. The Togashi family, which held the position of shugo, or provincial governor, had been weakened by internal rivalry. Competing factions struggled for power, drawing local warriors and religious communities into their disputes. Among the men who eventually emerged from this struggle was Togashi Masachika. His rise itself reveals how complicated the coming rebellion really was. Masachika had benefited from support connected to Ikko forces while fighting for power. Once his authority became more secure, however, the alliance deteriorated. Masachika attempted to curb the growing influence of the religious leagues inside Kaga. The result was the opposite of what he intended. In 1488, a major uprising erupted. Forces associated with the Ikko movement mobilized against him. Medieval accounts give enormous numbers for the rebels, but such figures are difficult to trust. The outcome is far more certain. Masachika could not suppress them. His enemies surrounded his position at Takao Castle. Facing defeat, the provincial governor took his own life. For Kaga, this was more than another episode in the endless warfare of the 15th century. An established provincial ruler had fallen without a neighboring daimyo conquering his territory. The coalition that destroyed his authority drew heavily on religious communities inside the province, while also involving local warriors and other groups with their own interests. Power had shifted in a way that did not fit the familiar pattern of one samurai house simply replacing another. And after Masachika died, the movement did something even more remarkable. It remained. No victorious daimyo marched into Kaga and immediately restored the old political order. The uprising had won. Now its participants had to discover whether resistance could become something more durable. What emerged would later acquire a famous name: the Peasants' Kingdom. The phrase captures the shock of what happened in Kaga, but not the full reality. There was no modern republic of equal farmers. Samurai families remained. Local elites continued to exercise power. Religious institutions, village organizations, and warrior interests competed and cooperated inside a political system that changed over time. What made Kaga extraordinary was that no single daimyo simply replaced Masachika. For decades, authority remained divided among local forces, while Hongan-ji's influence became increasingly important. Religious communities that had helped mobilize rebellion now formed part of a broader network capable of coordinating people and resources across the province. That gave Kaga a durability few rebellions achieved. Defeating one leader could not end a movement rooted in many communities. A castle could be captured, a rival family could be destroyed. But authority spread among temples, settlements, local warriors, and congregations was harder to remove with a single victory. And the implications reached beyond Kaga. As the 16th century progressed, warlords across Japan were consolidating domains and demanding tighter obedience from the people who lived within them. The Ikkō networks presented a different source of loyalty. Soon, that conflict would reach a young ruler attempting to secure his homeland in Mikawa. Some of the men forced to choose sides would be his own retainers. The young ruler was Matsudaira Motoyasu. History would remember him as Tokugawa Ieyasu. In 1563, that conflict reached Mikawa. Matsudaira Motoyasu, soon to take the name Tokugawa Ieyasu, was still decades away from becoming shogun. He was a young warlord, struggling to secure his home province, surrounded by rivals and dependent on men whose families had served his own for generations. Then a dispute involving Jodo Shinshu temples ignited a crisis inside his domain. The immediate causes were local, involving disputes over temple privileges and the reach of Ieyasu's authority. But once fighting began, it exposed something far more dangerous. Some of Ieyasu's own retainers belonged to the religious communities he was confronting. Now loyalty to their lord collided with loyalty to their faith. Some remained with Ieyasu. Others joined the opposition. Warrior households divided. Local communities took sides. Men who should have strengthened Ieyasu's rule instead appeared among those resisting it. For a ruler trying to consolidate a province, this was a profound threat. An invading army came from somewhere else. It could be located, confronted, and driven back. The Mikawa, Ikkō-ikki, existed inside the society Ieyasu was trying to govern. Its strength ran through temples, villages, local warriors, and relationships that could not be separated cleanly into friend and enemy. Fighting continued into 1564. Eventually, Ieyasu gained the upper hand. Organized resistance collapsed, and he moved against the religious institutions that had challenged his authority. Some rebellious retainers were punished or driven away, while others eventually returned to his service. Ieyasu survived the crisis and strengthened his control over Mikawa. In time, he would become one of the three great unifiers of Japan and establish the Tokugawa shogunate. But that future can obscure how vulnerable he had once been. Long before Sekigahara, Edo, or the title of shogun, a religious uprising inside his own homeland had divided men whose loyalty he needed to rule. And while Ieyasu succeeded in containing the challenge in Mikawa, the wider network remained powerful elsewhere. Soon it would collide with a warlord even less willing to tolerate independent centers of power, Oda Nobunaga. By the end of the 1560s, Nobunaga was transforming central Japan. He entered Kyoto in 1568 and increasingly imposed his authority across territories, roads, cities, and institutions vital to his expansion. One of the greatest obstacles ahead was Hongan-ji. Its principal center, Ishiyama Hongan-ji, stood on the site of what would later become Osaka. Surrounded by waterways and connected to prosperous commercial communities, it occupied a strategically valuable position. More importantly, its influence extended far beyond its defenses. Nobunaga's relations with Hongan-ji deteriorated as he sought to assert greater control around the capital and over Ishiyama itself. By 1570, the confrontation had become open warfare. Kenyo, the head of Hongan-ji, called followers to resist Nobunaga, while other powerful enemies were also pressing him elsewhere. This did not create one unified alliance under a single command, but it created exactly the kind of strategic environment Nobunaga could not ignore. Hongan-ji followers could mobilize in regions he needed to control. Regional lords hostile to Nobunaga could cooperate with them when their interests aligned. Resistance could appear in several places, while Nobunaga was already fighting rival warrior houses. His response grew increasingly destructive. One of the most important Ikko strongholds stood at Nagashima in Ise. Nobunaga attacked it repeatedly. Earlier campaigns failed to eliminate the resistance, but in 1574 he returned with overwhelming force. Oda troops isolated fortified positions and cut off avenues of escape. By the end of the campaign, the Nagashima complex had been destroyed, and large numbers of defenders and non-combatants had died. Nagashima revealed the direction of the struggle. Nobunaga was learning that defeating Ikko resistance required more than winning a battlefield engagement. Strongholds had to be isolated. Support had to be cut away. Communities capable of remobilizing resistance had to be brought under control. It was a brutal method, and it worked. But Nagashima was not the center of Hongan-ji power. That lay at Ishiyama, and there, the same strategy would require years. Ishiyama Hongan-ji was exceptionally difficult to isolate. Its position near Osaka Bay gave it access to waterways and commercial routes, while rivers, wetlands, fortified settlements, and surrounding terrain complicated any attempt to crush it through direct assault. Kenyo also had something walls alone could never provide: connections. Hongan-ji followers existed across multiple provinces. Merchants and maritime routes could help move supplies. Regional enemies of Nobunaga had their own reasons to keep Ishiyama alive. The result was a confrontation that lasted, in different phases, for roughly a decade. It was not one continuous 10-year siege. Campaigns intensified and receded. Negotiations interrupted fighting. Alliances changed. Nobunaga faced enemies elsewhere, while Hongan-ji depended on outside support to prevent complete isolation. One of the most important lifelines came from Western Japan. The Mori clan opposed Nobunaga and helped supply Ishiyama by sea. In 1576, Oda forces attempted to block that route near Kizugawaguchi. The Mori naval forces and their allies broke through, defeated the Oda fleet, and delivered supplies to Hongan-ji. For a movement supposedly facing Japan's most formidable rising warlord, survival itself had become a victory. But Nobunaga adapted. In 1578, Oda naval forces confronted the Mori effort again at Kizugawaguchi. This time, Nobunaga's side prevailed, making the maritime supply route increasingly difficult to sustain. The balance began to shift. Nobunaga's other enemies were being defeated or neutralized. The territories around Ishiyama came under greater pressure. Routes that had carried men and supplies became harder to use. There was no single moment when Hongan-ji suddenly became helpless. Its world was being narrowed around it. That was the real significance of Nobunaga's strategy. Kaga had shown that a coalition rooted inside local society could overthrow a provincial ruler. Mikawa had shown that religious allegiance could divide even a samurai lord's own retainers. Ishiyama demonstrated the challenge on its largest scale. The resistance included farmers and townspeople, but also religious leaders, merchants, sailors, local elites, and warriors. Its endurance came from the connections among them, and from the larger political struggle surrounding Nobunaga. A conventional enemy might collapse when its commander died or its castle fell. Hongan-ji had survived because its power was spread across people, places, and alliances. So Nobunaga attacked the conditions that allowed that resistance to continue. One stronghold, one ally, one supply route at a time. By the end of the 1570s, Ishiyama still stood, but the network around it was beginning to break. By 1580, Ishiyama Hongan-ji was still standing, but the balance had become impossible to ignore. Nagashima was gone. Important enemies had been defeated or neutralized. Maritime supply had become harder to maintain. Territory around Ishiyama was falling under greater Oda pressure. Negotiation offered a way out, before isolation became destruction. Emperor Ogimachi became involved in efforts to end the conflict, and in 1580, a settlement was reached. Kenyo agreed to leave Ishiyama Hongan-ji. His son Kyonyo resisted the decision and remained for a time with followers who wanted to continue the struggle. Eventually, they too abandoned the complex. Soon afterward, Ishiyama burned. Exactly how the fire began remains uncertain. Different accounts offer different explanations, and the evidence does not allow a confident answer. Politically, however, the result was clear. The great fortified center that had resisted Nobunaga for years was gone. Ishiyama had endured through religious organization, fortified communities, commerce, maritime supply, regional alliances, and people from different levels of society. Nobunaga had not overcome it through one spectacular victory. He had isolated it until continued resistance became increasingly impossible. After roughly a decade of conflict, Hongan-ji had yielded. Yet even then, the story was not finished. Far to the north, in the province where the Ikko movement had achieved its most extraordinary political success, resistance continued. Kaga had not yet been completely subdued. In 1580, Oda forces captured Oyama-gobo, one of the principal centers of Hongan-ji power in Kaga. It was a devastating blow, but it was not the end. Resistance survived around fortified positions such as Torigoe and Futoge in the southern part of the province. Oda commanders pushed deeper into the region, and Torigoe fell. Then the rebels came back. In 1581, local insurgents rose again and retook Torigoe, showing how difficult it remained to convert military conquest into permanent control. The response was severe. Oda forces returned, and the stronghold changed hands again. Even after that defeat, unrest did not disappear completely. In 1582, resistance erupted once more. This time, Oda forces crushed the remaining organized opposition. Nearly a century had passed since the uprising of 1488 brought down Togashi Masachika. The political world, sometimes remembered as Kaga's Peasants Kingdom, was finally over. And then history delivered one final irony. That same year, Oda Nobunaga died at Honnoji. The warlord whose campaigns had dismantled the great centers of Ikkō resistance did not live to create the final political order that emerged from the Sengoku age. Tokugawa Ieyasu did. The young ruler who had once watched his own retainers divide over the Mikawa Ikkō-ikki eventually became shogun. Politically, the samurai had won. But the faith and the networks behind the uprisings had proved something lasting. Authority could be challenged by loyalties a warrior lord did not control. The Ikkō-ikki never replaced the samurai, and their political and military independence was eventually broken. Jodo Shinshu, however, survived the wars that destroyed its armed strongholds. That distinction matters. A castle could make a lord difficult to attack. An army could make him dangerous. But when thousands of people discovered a loyalty stronger than obedience to the ruler above them, even Japan's greatest warriors could be forced to fight for the right to rule. The castles they defended are gone. The armies that gathered beneath their banners disappeared centuries ago. But the question they left behind still remains. Where does power truly come from? From the rulers who command obedience, or from the people who decide, together, that obedience has limits? Perhaps that was the real threat of the Ikkō-ikki. Not that they could defeat every samurai who came against them, but that, for nearly a century, they proved that even the most powerful warriors in Japan could be challenged from below. So what made the Ikkō-ikki truly dangerous? The weapons they carried, or the belief that bound them together? Tell us what you think in the comments. And if you want more stories of the people who challenged the powers of their age, subscribe to Blood and Thrones.